Welcome to the Boring Historian. If you enjoy drifting off to calming, slow history, remember to subscribe for more. Before we begin, I'd love to know where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it for you right now. Now, let us quietly step back into a world forever changed by one of history's darkest moments, the Black Death in medieval England. In the quiet year of 1348, as England carried on with its ordinary rhythms, no one could have imagined the invisible visitor making its way across the sea. Life was marked by familiar sounds, the tolling of church bells, the creak of cartwheels along muddy lanes, the lowing of cattle, and the chatter of market days. But far away, on the continent, a sickness had already left cities empty and villages silent. Chroniclers spoke of entire towns in Italy and France where grass grew in the streets, and where bells rang too often for funeral prayers. These were whispers, rumors perhaps, that seemed distant to English ears. England was separated by the Channel, and that body of water often felt like a shield, yet even the Channel could not hold back what was to come. It began with ships. The medieval world relied on the steady arrival of vessels carrying wool, wine, salt, and grain. These ships tied England to France, to Flanders, to the wider European economy, but they carried more than trade goods. In their holds, in the shadows between barrels, lived rats, and on those rats, fleas. Within those fleas, the bacterium that modern science calls Yersinia pestis. No one in medieval England knew such a name. To them, what was coming was unseeable, unknowable, and unstoppable. The first port to feel its presence was likely Melcombe Regis in Dorset. During the summer of 1348, some chroniclers say it was Weymouth, others Bristol. The truth is hard to know, for the spread was fast, and memory blurred by fear. What we do know is that sailors staggered ashore ill, some already covered with swellings black and painful lumps beneath their arms or in their groins. These were the telltale buboes, the signs of the plague that would later give it its name, the Black Death. At first, villagers and townsfolk must have looked on with uncertainty. Illness was no stranger in medieval life. Fevers, dysentery, smallpox all had claimed lives before, but this was different. Victims would burn with fever, suffer weakness and pain, and within days elapse, often dying in less than a week. Their bodies were marked not only by swellings, but by dark blotches on the skin, bruise-like patches that spread across the limbs. To the eye, it seemed as though the body itself was turning against its owner. The sickness did not remain on the docks. It clung to travelers and crept inland. Merchants who came to the ports carried goods and, unknowingly, the infection back to their towns. A sack of grain, a bundle of cloth, even the fleas hidden in the fur of a cat or dog could serve as its vessel. Roads that once connected communities now carried the shadow of death. By autumn, the plague had moved swiftly across the south of England. Places that had once bustled with daily life, markets filled with the cries of traders, fields busy with harvest, were touched by fear. Each new death was more than a loss, it was a warning. Families began to look at one another with suspicion. Was that cough the start of something more? Was the neighbor's sudden fever a sign of God's punishment? People searched for explanations, but none made sense. Some said it came from the air itself, poisoned by strange weather or distant earthquakes. Others believed it was the anger of heaven, punishment for sins left unconfessed. In taverns and churches, whispers turned into murmurs. Could this be the end of days? The plague did not explain itself. It simply arrived and spread, a silent, merciless visitor. By the close of 1348, the sickness had taken root in England. Deaths multiplied. Graveyards that once took months to fill now overflowed in weeks. Priests struggled to perform rites quickly enough, and some fled altogether. The ships that had once promised prosperity and trade had instead delivered devastation. In less than a season, England had shifted from ordinary hardship to extraordinary crises. The arrival of the silent killer was only the beginning. In the stillness of those early months, as bells tolled again and again, the old certainties of medieval England, faith in God's mercy, trust in community, reliance on the rhythms of harvest and market, began to feel fragile. Few could yet imagine how much would be broken, but already the shadow of the plague lay heavy over the land. When the plague arrived in 1348, it did not strike a strong and confident kingdom. Medieval England was already worn down by decades of hardship. For generations, the lives of ordinary people had been balanced on a knife's edge. Harvests were unpredictable, the weather often cruel, and survival depended on the fragile success of crops and animals. A single poor season could mean hunger, and several in a row meant famine. The memory of such famine was not far from people's minds. Only a few decades earlier, In the early 1300s, England had suffered the Great Famine. Rains fell endlessly, crops rotted, and livestock perished. Many peasants had watched neighbors starve or themselves gone hungry through long winters when food was scarce. This collective memory of suffering made the people of England already weary and cautious. Long before the plague ever appeared, the structure of society itself offered little comfort. England was a feudal land. At the bottom, peasants and serfs worked the land, bound by law and custom to their lords. Their lives were not their own, but tied to obligations of labor, rent, and duty. A peasant family might toil endlessly in the fields, producing wheat, barley, oats, and rye. Yet much of their produce was owed to the lord of the manor. What remained was often just enough to keep them alive. Hunger was a constant companion, and any illness or poor harvest could tip a family into ruin. Even in the towns, where some found freedom outside the direct control of lords, life was hard. Streets were narrow, sanitation was poor, and waste was often thrown directly into the lanes. Fresh water was scarce, and wells could be easily contaminated. Disease already moved quickly in such environments. Dysentery, fevers, and smallpox were familiar foes. For the people of medieval England, sickness was not unusual, it was expected, a part of life, yet what they had known before was manageable in its pace. It did not sweep entire communities away in a matter of days. Medicine, too, offered little hope. The medieval understanding of health was based largely on the ancient theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow, bile, and black bile. Doctors believed that imbalance among these humors caused sickness. Treatments often involved bleeding, purging, or herbal remedies meant to restore balance. Astrology was also considered essential. A doctor might consult the stars before diagnosing or prescribing a cure. Healing was more an art of ritual and tradition than of science. Against a disease as swift and deadly as the plague, these practices were powerless. Religion filled the gaps where medicine failed. People prayed to saints, carried charms, and sought holy water to protect themselves. The church offered not just spiritual guidance but also explanations for suffering. Hardship was seen as part of God's will, a trial to be endured, or a punishment for sin. Yet when the Black Death struck, these explanations would be tested in ways they never had before. England's population was dense compared to its resources. Villages dotted the countryside, with cottages clustered around manors and churches, while towns bustled with trade. The economy depended heavily on agriculture, with wool being one of the few profitable exports. It was a system that required many hands in the fields, many backs spent in labor. Any disruption to that delicate balance threatened the entire structure. So when the first signs of plague appeared in 1348, they came to a kingdom already strained. Fields had only just begun to recover from past famines. Villages still bore scars of hunger and poverty. Families lived close together in small, smoky homes, sharing not just space but also air and illness. The feudal system pressed hard upon them, keeping most people poor and vulnerable. It is within this fragile world that the Black Death made its entrance. A sickness so swift and merciless would strike not a land of plenty, but one already struggling to stand. England was a house of timber and straw, patched but never solid, waiting only for a spark. The plague would be that spark, one that did not merely burn but consumed, leaving a society broken, reshaped, and forever changed. Once the plague slipped past the ports, it did not linger only by the sea. It traveled silently inward, following the paths of trade and travel, creeping into the very heart of England. Merchants on horseback, carts laden with goods, and wandering travelers carried more than wool, salt, or stories from afar. Unknowingly, they bore with them the plague, hidden in fleas, clinging to fabrics, or nestled in grain sacks. The narrow roads that connected England's villages became the arteries through which death flowed. The small hamlets were often the first to feel its touch. These tiny communities of perhaps only a few dozen families were built on cooperation and trust. Neighbors worked each other's fields, shared tools, and gathered in the same church. But once the sickness entered, that trust faltered. A fever, a sudden swelling under the arm, or dark patches on the skin were enough to spark terror. Some families locked themselves inside their cottages, refusing to help even their closest neighbors. Others abandoned their homes entirely, fleeing to the woods or seeking refuge in distant towns. Though often carrying the disease along with them, the rhythm of rural life broke apart. Fields that had for generations been tilled at the same season fell quiet. Crops withered without hands to tend them. Sheep and cattle wandered untended, some starving, others taken by wolves or disease. In a world so deeply tied to the land, The silence of the fields was more than just a sign of neglect, it was a signal of collapse. Without farmers too, so there could be no harvest. Without harvest there could be no bread. The food chain that sustained village and manor alike began to fray. Death touched every part of these small settlements. A single household stricken could mean a plowman lost, his wife left sickly, and children alone. Sometimes entire families perished, their cottage left empty, its thatch falling, its hearth cold. The dead were buried hastily, if at all. Churchyards, meant to be places of solemn rest, overflowed, and graves were dug quickly, often shallow. Some bodies lay unburied for days, as there was no one strong enough or willing enough to carry them. Fear transformed the bonds of community. Where once a village might have banded together in hard times, now suspicion grew. A cough was cause for distance, a fever for avoidance. Those who remained healthy avoided contact with the sick, sometimes refusing even to fetch water or bring food to their closest kin. In this way, the plague not only killed bodies but also eroded the trust that held medieval villages together. The stories that filtered through from village to village painted a grim picture. A farmer might arrive at market, only to hear that a neighboring hamlet had been wiped clean, its fields untended, its cottages abandoned. Travelers spoke of empty lanes, of silence where bells once rang. Chroniclers would later describe deserted places, overgrown with grass, where once had been life and laughter. These were not exaggerations. Many English villages were so devastated that they never recovered. Some disappeared entirely, lost to time, leaving only faint traces in the landscape. What historians now call deserted medieval villages. The plagues spread across the countryside were swift and devastating. By winter of 1348, large portions of southern England had been touched. By 1349, it pressed northward, through the Midlands, toward Norfolk, Lincolnshire, and beyond. No road was safe, no hamlet too small to be overlooked. The sickness cared nothing for geography or size. It moved where people moved. It followed the patterns of medieval life, and in doing so, it broke them. In these early years of the Black Death's arrival, the villagers were the silent witnesses of England's unraveling. The cottage fires that once glowed at dusk were extinguished, and the laughter of children on the village green was replaced by the toll of bells and the rustle of wind through empty lanes. This was how the plague spread quietly, relentlessly transforming the familiar landscape of rural England into one marked by fear, silence, and absence. If the countryside suffered in silence, the towns and cities of England endured the plague in a different, more visible way. By the late summer of 1348, the Black Death had reached the larger settlements, where narrow streets, overcrowded houses, and poor sanitation created the perfect stage for its deadly performance. England's towns were not large by modern standards, but they were dense, busy, and alive with the rhythms of trade. London, with perhaps 50,000 souls, was the heart of the kingdom. Its streets, crowded with merchants, artisans, laborers, and priests. It was here, in such tight quarters, that the plague struck with a speed and ferocity that shocked even the hardened citizens who had seen sickness before. The signs of collapse were immediate. London's markets, once filled with the calls of sellers and the haggling of buyers, began to empty. Stalls that had stood for generations were suddenly left unattended, their cloth coverings fluttering in the wind. But the silence was broken often not by life, but by the creak of carts carrying the dead. Chroniclers spoke of men hired to roam the streets with wagons, calling out for bodies to be brought forth. Families too weak or too fearful to leave their homes dragged their dead to doorways, leaving them there for collection. The sheer number of deaths overwhelmed the city. Traditional burials, with prayers said and graves carefully dug, became impossible. Instead, great pits were dug, wide and deep, into which bodies were laid side by side. By some accounts, thousands were buried in a single trench. Priests struggled to keep pace with the ceremonies, and many themselves fell ill and died. The church bells, once a sound of steady rhythm marking hours of prayer or festival, now rang almost constantly to announce death, until even the ringers could not keep up. Fear reshaped daily life. People avoided one another, crossing the street to escape contact. Shops closed their doors. Inns and taverns, once centers of noisy gathering, went silent. The life of the city was interrupted, as though a hand had pressed pause on the familiar routines of medieval trade and chatter. Even those who remained healthy found themselves trapped in a city of shadows, surrounded by the constant reminder of mortality. Some fled, but flight was not always safety. In their panic, Londoners carried the plague into smaller towns and villages, spreading it further. Those who stayed behind found themselves surrounded by emptiness. In places like Bristol, York, and Norwich, similar scenes unfolded. Streets once so lively with artisans, apprentices, and hawkers became ghostly. Windows were shuttered, doors barred. The air carried the sound of weeping, of coughing, and sometimes of silence where entire households had perished. The stench of death was inescapable. With so many bodies, and so few left to tend them properly, the city air grew heavy. Fires were lit in the streets, great bonfires of straw and herbs, in the hope that the smoke might cleanse the poisoned air. People carried posies of flowers to their noses, or held spices close, believing that sweet smells might ward off the corruption. Doctors, when they dared venture out, often wore robes and coverings, though not yet the beaked masks that would later become infamous. They carried canes to touch the sick without direct contact, and instructed citizens to avoid the breath of the infected. The horror of the towns was not only in the scale of death, but in the loss of familiarity. Where once people had drawn strength from community, the crowded markets, the shared festivals, the bustling lanes now, those very qualities became dangers. Proximity, closeness, touch-all were threats. To live in London during the Black Death was to live in a city that no longer felt like itself. By the time winter arrived, tens of thousands had perished. Some estimates claim that half the population of London was lost in those terrible months. Entire guilds of craftsmen were broken, churches left half empty, and once thriving districts reduced to hushed ruin. The plague was not selective. Rich merchants, humble beggars, priests, and servants all fell alike. Death moved quickly, and with it, the certainty of survival faded. The towns of England had always been places of exchange and connection, the heart of medieval life. But in the face of the Black Death, they became places of fear and absence. Empty markets, shuttered taverns, silent workshops, these were the new landmarks of the city. London, Bristol, York, Norwich all were scarred, and as the towns fell silent, the rest of England looked on in dread, for if the great cities could not withstand the plague, what hope was there for the scattered villages and manors beyond? As the death toll mounted and the bells of parish churches rang endlessly for funerals, one of the great pillars of medieval society began to tremble: the church. For centuries, the church had been the keeper of souls, the voice of divine authority, the institution that claimed to have answers for both life and death. Yet, when the plague swept across England in 1348 and 1349, it left priests and monks as helpless as any farmer, blacksmith, or noble. The air was thick with incense, prayers rose in every cathedral, and yet the pestilence only grew worse. In small villages, priests were called again and again to anoint the dying. Many carried out their duty faithfully, holding the hands of the sick and whispering the last rites, only to fall ill themselves days later. Entire monasteries, once bustling with chanting monks, with gardens of herbs and libraries filled with scripture, became silent as the brothers within perished one by one. Some priests fled, abandoning their flocks, fearing that their holy robes could not protect them from fleas and sickness. Too many peasants. This was a devastating blow. If the church could not stand against God's wrath, what hope did ordinary people have? Yet in this moment of collapse, new movements rose. Flagellants, barefoot and half-naked, marched through towns, whipping their backs with iron-tipped cords, believing that England was suffering under God's punishment for sin. People gathered to watch these strange, grim processions, some joining in out of desperation, hoping that such self-inflicted suffering might turn away the plague. At the same time, superstition flourished. Holy relics were carried through the streets. Bells were rung to drive away evil spirits. Some whispered that witches or foreigners had cursed the land. The Black Death tested not only the faith of individuals, but the very power of the church itself. Once unshakable, its moral authority cracked under the strain of endless funerals and unanswered prayers. For the first time, ordinary people began to wonder if the church truly held all the answers, or if perhaps God had turned his face away from England. As the plague continued its merciless sweep through England, one of the most frightening aspects of the disaster was its mystery. People could see its effects: the swellings under the skin, the fevers, the bodies carried out by the cartload, but they could not see its cause. In a world without microscopes, without the faintest notion of bacteria or fleas, explanations took on shapes drawn from faith, tradition, and fear. Some believed the air itself had turned poisonous. The theory of miasma, bad air rising from rotting matter or foul swamps, was an old one, and many thought the plague spread through invisible clouds drifting across the countryside. People carried posies of herbs, sprigs of rosemary, or sweet-smelling flowers, pressing them to their noses in hopes of purifying the breath they inhaled. Fires were lit in the streets, not for warmth but to cleanse the air, with thick smoke rising to drive away what was thought to be pestilential vapor. Others looked upward, to the heavens. Astrologers pointed to a strange alignment of planets in 1345, claiming that the stars themselves had conspired to poison the earth below. Pamphlets and word of mouth spread these warnings, and many took them as divine signs, believing that the plague was not a natural disaster at all but a cosmic one. For countless others, the explanation was far simpler and more terrible. It was the punishment of God. Every sin, every broken commandment, every failing of the faithful was thought to have built up until divine wrath spilled out in the form of the Black Death. In this way, the plague was not only a disease of the body but of the spirit, filling people with guilt, shame, and dread. And then came scapegoating. Rumors spread that foreigners, travelers, or outcast groups had poisoned wells. Jews, already marginalized in many parts of Europe, were accused of sorcery and wickedness, though in England most Jewish communities had already been expelled decades earlier. Still, suspicion lingered, and people looked to any outsider or unfamiliar neighbor with fear. In the absence of true knowledge, the plague became a canvas for the imagination, painted with old beliefs, desperate guesses, and the terror of the unknown. To live in that time was not only to face a deadly sickness, but to do so in darkness without the comfort of understanding why death had come. The rhythm of medieval life, so dependent on habit and routine, began to falter under the weight of the plague. Markets that had once been lively with the cries of merchants and the chatter of buyers fell silent. Stalls stood empty, their goods unsold, as fear kept people shuttered indoors. Grain, cloth, and meat could not easily change hands when neighbors hesitated to stand near one another. Trade routes that carried wool to the ports or salt inland from the coasts grew quiet, as wagons stood idle and drivers refused to risk travel. In the countryside, the fields themselves betrayed the breakdown. Farmers who had once risen with the dawn to tend their crops were dead, or too frightened to leave their cottages. Plows rusted at the edge of furrows left unfinished, and oxen wandered untended. Harvests rotted where they stood, uncollected and unwanted. The very basis of survival food seemed to dissolve before people's eyes, not simply because of the plague, but because the structures of daily labor had collapsed. Even families, the core of medieval existence, were shaken apart. Fear made people wary even of their closest kin. Parents hesitated to nurse sick children, and children fled homes where disease had entered. In many places, chroniclers remarked with sorrow that bonds of blood no longer guaranteed compassion. Some died alone, not because help was unavailable, but because fear outweighed love. The plague was not only a killer of bodies, it was a breaker of trust, of routine, and of the ordinary comforts that gave life meaning. A village without its market, a town without its trade, a family without its closeness, all of these left behind a world that felt hollow, silent, and profoundly changed. As the plague carried itself deeper into the countryside, entire villages began to vanish from the map of England. Some disappeared quickly, their populations cut down in a matter of weeks, leaving no one behind to tend fires or close doors. Others withered more slowly, as one household after another succumbed, until only silence lingered in places that had once rung with the hammer of smiths, the laughter of children, and the barking of dogs. The sight of a deserted village unsettled travelers. Houses stood with doors ajar, shutters creaking in the wind. In the fields, tools lay where they had last been used, sickles, plows abandoned mid-task, as if the workers had simply vanished. Roofs sagged as thatch fell untended, weeds grew high in gardens, and wild animals crept closer, reclaiming what humans had surrendered. The sound of birdsong replaced the chatter of markets, while foxes and deer walked boldly where no one was left to chase them. Chroniclers of the time spoke of wasted villages, and even centuries later, the outlines of these ghost settlements can still be traced. Low mounds marking where cottages once stood, faint ridges showing where plows once cut the earth. Each ruin whispered of families who once shared bread, worked side by side, and prayed together in their small parish churches, before being erased in a single season of death. For those who survived nearby, the emptying of a village was both a warning and a wound. To walk past an abandoned hamlet was to glimpse one's own possible future. Silence, decay, and the vanishing of all human presence. The landscape itself seemed to mourn, with lonely churches standing over fields gone untended, their bells no longer rung. In many parts of England, the plague did not just take lives, it erased entire communities from existence. The Black Death did not spare the castles and manor houses of medieval England. Though wealth and thick stone walls offered some protection, lords and landowners soon discovered that their fortunes depended less on their titles, and more on the hands of the peasants who worked their fields. As the plague swept through villages, it left not only cottages abandoned, but also acres of farmland lying fallow. For the nobility, accustomed to living off the steady labor of serfs, this sudden disappearance of workers was nothing short of catastrophic. A manor house might still stand proud upon a hill, its banners fluttering in the wind, but below, the surrounding lands told a different story. The plows no longer cut the soil, harvests rotted where they stood, and granaries remained empty. The lord's income, whether in grain, wool, or rents, dried up almost overnight. What use was land, no matter how vast, if there were no men and women left alive to till it? Many estates found themselves in decline, their wealth measured not in coin but in absence. In some cases, entire manorial households crumbled. Stewards, reeves, and servants died alongside peasants, leaving lords with no one to manage daily operations. Records from the period tell of unpaid rents piling high, not because peasants refused to pay, but because the tenants themselves were gone. Legal roles fell silent. Feudal obligations, so carefully balanced over centuries, were thrown into chaos as land lay unclaimed. Heirs perished, and contracts dissolved with the dead. For surviving peasants, this shift marked a rare moment of leverage. Desperate for labor, lords were forced to make concessions. Wages rose, freedoms expanded, and some serfs quietly slipped from bondage into more independent lives. Yet for landowners, such changes were deeply unsettling. They had long relied on an unquestioned hierarchy. The peasant worked, the lord profited, and the world remained stable. The plague shattered that arrangement. It exposed the fragility of power built on human lives, revealing that no estate, no matter how grand, could endure without the humble workers who sustained it. Thus the Black Death left scars not only on villages and towns, but also on the very structure of feudal society. Behind the manor's heavy doors, lords counted their losses not just in tenants and income, but in the collapse of a world order that had seemed eternal. Their lands might stretch as far as the eye could see, yet without the peasants, those fields became little more than empty ground, haunted by silence and loss. As the plague reduced England's population, the balance of life shifted in ways that no one could have predicted. Fields left untended and harvests lost meant that food became scarce. Grain that had once been plentiful grew more expensive, and prices for everyday necessities rose sharply. A loaf of bread that once cost a few pence now demanded a king's ransom, and salted meat, cheese, and butter became luxuries that only a few could afford. Hunger, which had always been a quiet companion in medieval life, now pressed heavily on the survivors, many of whom were already weakened by fear, disease, and exhaustion. Yet alongside scarcity came opportunity, a bitter but necessary paradox. With so many peasants dead, lords found themselves desperate for workers. Fields needed tending, livestock required care, and workshops demanded hands to craft goods. Those who had survived the plague suddenly found themselves in a rare position of leverage. A single plowman could demand higher wages. A shepherd, more freedom. A weaver, better conditions. In villages and towns alike, laborers recognized a new reality. The scarcity of skilled and unskilled labor gave them bargaining power that they had never known before. The government, however, tried to resist these shifts. The Statute of Laborers, issued in 1351, attempted to freeze wages and compel peasants to work for pre-plague rates, but enforcement was difficult, and in many areas, the law was openly defied. Workers moved from one estate to another, seeking better pay and more humane conditions. Lords grumbled, furious that centuries of custom were being appended. But even their wealth could not force people back into servitude when life itself was so fragile. Inflation added another layer of pressure. Prices for food and goods rose faster than coin could be earned. Ordinary people had to stretch their resources, often surviving on meager meals of pottage, bread, or occasional vegetables. Some bartered their labor for food, while others moved to towns hoping to find charity or employment. Despite the fear of disease, necessity forced travel, bringing survivors into contact with others and sometimes spreading illness further. In a cruel irony of survival, families faced impossible choices. Parents might send a child to work for a distant lord in exchange for a loaf of bread, while older relatives attempted to manage fields abandoned by missing neighbors. The social structure was strained, but the economy could not halt entirely, for life demanded movement, trade, and labor. In the midst of fear and grief, people adapted. Peasants who survived the plague became stronger negotiators of their own destinies, slowly reshaping a world in which they had once been powerless. In towns, the effects were equally striking. Artisans and merchants, fewer in number but still alive, could command higher prices for their work. The guilds, once rigid in control, faced shortages of apprentices and journeymen, which allowed surviving craftsmen more freedom and security than they had known in decades. Markets, though quieter and scarred by death, began to reflect a subtle shift. Scarcity and demand altered the rhythm of trade, and those who could work were valued in new, tangible ways. The Black Death thus left a paradoxical legacy. While it killed indiscriminately, it also altered the economy in ways that gave the survivors a measure of control over their lives. Hunger, loss, and fear remained, but alongside them emerged the faint glimmer of agency. Ordinary people, once bound by custom and expectation, discovered that survival itself could confer power. England, shaken and reduced in population, began to feel the tremors of social change that would ripple through its feudal structure for generations to come. The Black Death did more than take lives, it shook the very foundations of medieval society. Feudalism, the centuries-old system that bound peasants to the land and lords to their laborers, had relied on a steady, predictable population. Serfs and villains worked the fields in return for protection, lords collected rent and dues, and the social hierarchy remained largely unquestioned. But as the plague swept across England, that fragile balance began to crumble. Entire villages vanished, and with them, generations of laborers whose toil had supported manors and castles. Lords discovered that their power depended not merely on title or force, but on the presence of those who could work the land. When those people died in droves, the authority of the nobility was suddenly challenged by the simplest of truths. Without workers, fields lay barren, livestock starved, and rents went unpaid. Estates that once seemed secure were now threatened not by armies or rebellion, but by absence and scarcity. Surviving peasants quickly realized the newfound power in their hands. Where once they had been bound to the will of a lord, they could now demand higher wages, better working conditions, or freedom from onerous duties. A single skilled laborer, whether a plowman, shepherd, or miller, might now negotiate for pay far above what had been customary before the plague. Many moved from estate to estate, seeking opportunity, leaving lords scrambling to fill gaps with whoever remained. This shift altered more than economics. It changed relationships. The old, unquestioned obedience of serfs began to erode. Lords attempted to enforce traditional duties, but enforcement was uneven, and many peasants quietly resisted. Legal documents such as the Statute of Laborers sought to freeze wages and compel work at pre-plague levels, but they were widely ignored, particularly in rural areas where the demand for labor was greatest. Across England, power subtly shifted from landowners to the laborers themselves, marking a profound transformation in social dynamics. Even urban areas felt this change. Towns relied on artisans, craftsmen, and merchants whose numbers had also been reduced. Guilds, once rigid and controlling, struggled to maintain standards when so many members had died. Surviving workers could set terms, demand higher prices for their goods, and move with more freedom than they had previously known. Markets, workshops, and urban streets reflected a subtle but undeniable redistribution of influence. The psychological impact on the nobility was immense. Many lords could not grasp that centuries of inherited power might not protect them from a simple change in demographics. Manners that had seemed unshakable were now vulnerable, reliant on cooperation rather than command. Some attempted to maintain authority through force or legal strictures, but the reality of scarcity and labor shortages weakened their grasp. The very idea that a lord could compel work without consideration for wages or survival became increasingly untenable. In this way, the Black Death did more than kill. It disrupted a social contract that had endured for centuries. Feudalism, once a rigid structure dictating every aspect of life, began to fracture. The lords retained wealth and titles, but their control was diminished, while peasants and laborers found themselves with unprecedented agency. These changes would ripple forward for decades, shaping the eventual decline of the feudal system and laying the groundwork for a new social order. In villages and towns alike, the consequences of the plague were visible not only in empty homes and silent fields, but also in the quiet confidence of those who survived. The balance of power had shifted, subtly yet profoundly, marking the beginning of the end for a system that had dominated English life for centuries. England, reduced by disease, was nonetheless awakening to a new reality, one in which survival brought strength, and the old hierarchies could no longer be assumed absolute. The plague did not merely take lives at random, it selectively emptied the workforce that sustained England's economy and social order. Shepherds, ploughmen, millers, and craftsmen vanished from villages and towns alike, leaving estates and workshops eerily quiet. Where once the countryside had been alive with the rhythm of labor, the lowing of cattle, the clatter of hooves in plowed fields, the hum of weaving looms, now there was only silence broken occasionally by the wind through empty cottages or the solitary crowing of a rooster with no human hand to feed it. The absence of laborers struck hard at the lords and landowners who relied on their work. Crops went unharvested, granaries emptied, and livestock wandered untended. A manor might have acres of fertile soil, but without the hands to till it, the land was no longer a source of wealth, it became a burden. Towns, too, felt the effects acutely. Artisans and tradesmen, from blacksmiths to shoemakers, simply did not exist in the numbers needed to keep commerce flowing. Markets were quiet, workshops closed, and goods that had been common became rare. Yet for those who survived, scarcity brought a new power. A single skilled ploughman, once bound to the will of his lord, could now negotiate higher wages or better terms of service. Shepherds demanded more freedom in exchange for tending the flocks, while craftsmen could ask for increased pay or relocate to towns where their skills were more urgently needed. Families found themselves in a position previously unimaginable. Their labor was not merely survival, it was valuable, almost precious, in a way that gave them leverage over those who had once dictated their lives. This shift did not happen evenly, and it was not without tension. Lords tried to enforce the old rules, issuing proclamations that wages should remain fixed and laborers should not leave their manors. Yet enforcement was often impossible. The countryside was vast, and workers could quietly move from village to village, or even town to town, seeking better conditions. In urban centers, guilds struggled to maintain standards as the number of apprentices and journeymen fell dramatically. Artisans could demand higher fees for their work, and in some cases, entire workshops changed ownership as skilled workers realized their own value. The scarcity of labor also reshaped relationships within families. Younger members were sent to work in different villages or towns to take advantage of demand, and households often negotiated internally over who would go and who would stay. While many feared for the health of those who traveled, the economic reality made mobility necessary. Survival now meant not only avoiding disease, but also managing labor wisely, ensuring that the family could eat and continue its line despite the uncertainties of life in plague-stricken England. Even kings and governments took note. Taxes depended on labor and production, and with fields and workshops empty, revenues declined. The Statute of Laborers, passed in 1351, attempted to control wages and restrict movement, but the law proved unenforceable in many areas. The scarcity of workers had shifted the balance of power subtly yet undeniably. For the first time, the laborers themselves had a voice, a tangible measure of security born from survival in the midst of death. In every village and town, the absence of the many highlighted the value of the few. England had been hollowed by disease, yet those who remained carried with them a new reality. Labor had become currency, survival had become leverage, and the world once rigidly ordered by hierarchy had grown flexible in ways that would endure long after the plague passed. The Black Death was not only a crisis for families, peasants, and lords, it was a test for the English government, a challenge that revealed the limits of medieval authority. As the plague reduced the population, towns emptied, villages vanished, and laborers gained unprecedented leverage. The monarchy and local officials scrambled to maintain control. England's rulers understood the threat. If wages rose unchecked and peasants refused to honor old obligations, the very structure of the feudal economy could collapse. In response, the government issued the Statute of Laborers in 1351, an ambitious attempt to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and compel all able-bodied people to work. The law required that peasants accept the same pay as before the plague, forbade them from fleeing their manors in search of better employment, and imposed harsh penalties for defiance. Officials hoped that by regulating movement and labor, they could restore order and prevent the social upheaval that mass mortality threatened to unleash. Yet the statute was largely unenforceable. England was a patchwork of towns, villages, and manorial estates, separated by miles of roads and rough terrain. Local authorities were often powerless, either too weak or too sympathetic to compel compliance. Laborers simply moved to places where their work was in higher demand, often avoiding scrutiny or bribing officials to ignore their defiance. The government's proclamations rang hollow in the face of economic necessity. For surviving workers understood their newfound value in ways that kings and lords could not easily counter. Resistance took many forms. Some peasants openly defied wage restrictions, leaving manors to negotiate freely with new employers. Others quietly refused to work at all for lords who had previously demanded servitude, without consideration for the changed reality. Even in towns, artisans and journeymen challenged guild rules and local regulations, seeking higher pay or better contracts. The old expectations of obedience and duty were being rewritten, not by rebellion alone, but by the simple arithmetic of survival. There were fewer hands, and those hands were in demand. The monarchy and government, faced with this persistent challenge, could do little more than issue fines or threaten imprisonment. Enforcement required manpower that itself had been diminished by the plague. Officials were stretched thin, and the administrative machinery of the kingdom strained to cope. In many regions, law became theoretical rather than practical, a reminder of what ought to be, rather than a reflection of reality on the ground. This struggle illustrated a fundamental truth of the post-plague world. Power had shifted. Authority could be proclaimed from the throne, but the realities of labor, scarcity, and survival dictated what was possible. England's government had never faced a crisis of this magnitude, and its efforts, though earnest, often fell short. In the end, the Black Death was a teacher to kings and officials alike, revealing that human resilience, necessity, and movement could outweigh centuries of tradition and law. While the Black Death reshaped the physical and social landscapes of England, it also left a profound mark on the minds and hearts of those who survived. The constant presence of death, the sudden disappearance of neighbors and friends, and the eerie silence of once bustling villages created a psychological burden that was almost as heavy as the disease itself. Fear became a daily companion, not just of illness, but of human interaction. To see someone cough, to hear a fevered moan from the next cottage, or even to approach a neighbor for help could inspire dread. Mistrust grew like a shadow over communities. Neighbors who had once shared bread, tended one another's children, and worked together in the fields now hesitated to enter each other's homes. Touch, once commonplace, became suspect. Hands that had clasped in friendship or solidarity were now avoided, and even family members maintained cautious distance. Some survivors chose isolation, wandering through abandoned streets and fields alone, fearful that even the familiar could harbor death. Alongside fear came superstition, which flourished in the absence of scientific understanding. People turned to charms, amulets, and herbal concoctions to ward off the invisible threat. Holy relics were carried in processions, prayers repeated endlessly, and rituals performed in desperate hope that the plague might spare them. Flagellants marched through towns, self-flagellating in the belief that such acts could atone for communal sin, drawing crowds both fearful and fascinated. Astrology and portents in the heavens were scrutinized for warnings, and every misfortune, every cough, every dark patch on the skin was interpreted as a sign. The mental toll of mass death was staggering. Survivors often found themselves haunted by images of the sick, the dying, and the heaps of bodies being removed from homes and streets. Grief was nearly constant, and with so many lost, traditional mourning practices could not be observed. Families buried their own members quickly, sometimes without clergy or ceremony, leaving the bereaved to cope alone. The human mind, unaccustomed to such widespread and indiscriminate loss, struggled to make sense of it. Chroniclers noted despair, sudden bursts of melancholy, and a pervasive sense of the world having shifted into a darker, unpredictable place. Even towns that survived the immediate onslaught bore the scars of fear for years. Markets, though reopening, were quieter. Children, having grown up amidst death, learned caution too early. Trust, once the foundation of community life, was fragile. Every cough, every fever, every sudden absence reminded the living that their world had been irrevocably altered. The psychological shadows of the Black Death endured long after the plague itself receded. It left behind a populace more wary, more aware of mortality, and deeply conscious of the fragility of life. England, though eventually recovering, would never forget the mental weight of these months and years. A silent imprint etched into the collective consciousness of medieval society. In London, the Black Death left an imprint both visible and haunting. The city's cramped streets and crowded homes could not contain the dead, and the familiar rhythm of funerals and burials was overwhelmed by sheer numbers. As bodies accumulated, officials were forced to find new ways to manage death on an unprecedented scale. The result was the creation of mass graves, grim pits dug quickly to hold the countless lives claimed by the plague. These pits were often wide, deep trenches, sometimes holding hundreds of bodies stacked side by side. Chroniclers describe the chilling work of gravediggers, who labored tirelessly, removing the dead day after day, often falling ill themselves. The task was relentless, as the bodies arrived faster than they could be interred. Many of those left behind were family members too weak or too frightened to assist, and in some cases, corpses were simply carried from houses by hired men or carts and dumped into the waiting trenches. The scale of these graves was staggering. In some locations, estimates suggest that a single pit could hold thousands of bodies. Streets that had once bustled with trade and conversation became places of quiet dread, where the stench of death lingered despite efforts to burn herbs, straw, and pitch to mask it. Communities, once bound by closeness and routine, now confronted the inevitability of mortality in its most overwhelming form. Funerals, once solemn and structured, were reduced to near mechanical operations. Priests, themselves few in number and often ill, could not perform rites for every soul. Families, desperate to mark the passing of loved ones, sometimes left corpses in open air or brought them directly to the pits, prayers whispered in haste. There was little time for mourning, no opportunity to grieve properly. The rituals that gave life and death meaning were stretched to their limits, and the human experience of loss became raw and uncontained. Even in the dead of night, the city seemed haunted. The clang of carts carrying the deceased, the murmur of fearful survivors, and the eerie silence of emptied streets created a sense of London as a city in limbo, suspended between life and death. The visual of open graves, the smell of decay, and the knowledge that no household was untouched produced a collective trauma that lingered long after the plague subsided. These death pits, silent yet overwhelming, became a symbol of the Black Death's indiscriminate power. They reminded the living of the fragility of life, the randomness of mortality, and the limits of human ability to cope with catastrophe. London, a city built on commerce, politics, and social gathering, was transformed temporarily into a landscape of grief, silence, and shadows, its streets haunted not just by fear, but by the memory of those consigned to mass graves. For the youngest members of medieval society, the Black Death brought a world transformed by fear, grief, and uncertainty. Children who had once known the rhythms of home, village, and family found those familiar patterns shattered. Schools and churches closed, as teachers and clergy either succumbed to illness or abandoned their posts out of fear. The laughter of playmates, the simple joys of running through fields or helping in the garden, was replaced by silence and the heavy presence of death. Many children lost parents or guardians, sometimes suddenly and without warning. A mother who had once tucked her child into bed might vanish overnight, leaving small hands to clutch empty sheets. Fathers, unprepared for both grief and responsibility, sometimes could not care for their surviving children, leaving siblings to fend for themselves. In some cases, households dissolved entirely, with orphans wandering from village to village in search of relatives, food, or shelter. The social safety nets that existed were fragile, and for a child alone, life became a perilous navigation of hunger, fear, and loneliness. Even children who survived with their families faced the psychological burden of constant exposure to death. They witnessed neighbors carried away in carts, bodies laid in hastily dug graves, and relatives succumbing to a disease that no medicine could halt. These early encounters with mortality left lasting impressions, shaping their understanding of life and instilling a cautious, almost wary approach to the world. Some chroniclers describe children who became unusually quiet, withdrawn or wary of contact with others, as the pervasive fear of contagion seeped into every corner of life. In the absence of parents, older siblings often assumed adult responsibilities, tending fields, caring for younger children, or performing household chores far beyond their years. Childhood, once a time of learning and play, became a season of labor, survival, and constant vigilance. In urban areas, children might be sent to live with distant relatives or strangers, or even hired out as servants or apprentices, often to families who themselves had lost members to the plague. Each movement carried risk, each new household presented potential danger, and yet there was no alternative but to adapt quickly or perish. Amid such hardship, communities sometimes tried to protect children through charity, kinship networks, or church aid, but resources were limited and overwhelmed. Orphans were particularly vulnerable, and the loss of parental guidance meant that moral, religious, and social education was frequently interrupted. For many, The Black Death marked the abrupt end of innocence. Games, stories, and traditions faded into the background, replaced by the grim realities of survival, responsibility, and grief. Thus, for children, the plague was more than illness, it was a complete upheaval of their world. They had to navigate hunger, loss, fear, and solitude, learning to grow up before their time. In every village and town, the youngest members of society bore witness to the fragility of life, carrying memories of empty homes, silent streets, and the absence of those they once loved. The Black Death etched itself into childhood itself, leaving impressions that would echo across generations and shape the very fabric of English society. The Black Death did more than kill, it transformed the very way people thought, created, and worshipped. In the years following the plague, English art, literature, and religious practices began to reflect the pervasive presence of mortality, the fragility of life, and the inevitability of death. Where once beauty, abundance, and human accomplishment were celebrated, a new aesthetic emerged, one that was somber, reflective, and obsessed with the cycle of life and decay. In literature, chronicles and poems increasingly focused on the suddenness of death and the impermanence of worldly things. Writers painted vivid pictures of skeletal figures, deserted streets, and abandoned villages. Morality tales became more common, warning of sin and divine punishment, often using the imagery of corpses, decay, and the plague itself to teach lessons about piety and humility. Even tales of romance or adventure were tinged with awareness of mortality, reminding readers that life could end at any moment. Art followed a similar trajectory. Manuscripts, church murals, and wood carvings began to depict macabre imagery, skeletons leading people to their graves, dancing figures representing the universality of death, and angels or devils weighing souls in scenes of judgment. Religious iconography became more somber, emphasizing suffering, penance, and the afterlife. Churches commissioned works not to glorify earthly achievements, but to remind congregations of the ephemeral nature of life and the necessity of moral preparedness. Religious practices themselves adapted to a world suddenly dominated by grief. Processions, prayers for the dead, and penitential rites became more common. Pilgrimages were undertaken not for adventure or devotion alone, but as acts of survival, penance, or hope for divine protection. Flagellant movements, though controversial, gained followers who believed that public penance could avert further calamity. Masses for the dead multiplied, and charitable acts toward the poor or orphaned were seen not only as virtue but as a way to seek protection from mortality. Even festivals and communal gatherings were altered. Where once celebrations might have been boisterous and full of life, they now contained reminders of death, images of skeletons, prayers for those lost, and quiet moments of reflection. The culture of England absorbed the memory of the plague in ways that permeated everyday life, shaping how communities thought about health, morality, and the passage of time. In this transformation, the Black Death left a paradoxical legacy. Though it brought devastation and grief, it also fostered a culture deeply aware of life's fragility and the consequences of human behavior. Art, literature, and religious practice became vessels for collective memory, carrying forward lessons of mortality, humility, and the inevitability of change. In towns and villages, the echoes of these shifts were visible not only in manuscripts and murals, but in the way people conducted themselves, cautious, reflective, and forever marked by the shadow of death. The immediate horrors of the Black Death, mass death, abandoned villages, and labor shortages were only the beginning. In its aftermath, England experienced profound and lasting economic changes that reshaped the structure of society for generations. With so many workers gone, surviving peasants and laborers suddenly found themselves in a position of unexpected power. Wages rose, mobility increased, and the old hierarchies that had once dictated the flow of wealth and labor began to shift. For the nobility, the effects were striking and often alarming. Landowners who had relied on the steady labor of serfs now found their estates under strain. Fields went untended, livestock required more care than one family could provide, and the flow of rent and produce that had supported lavish lifestyles weakened. Many noble families were forced to sell land, renegotiate terms with tenants, or make concessions to keep their estates productive. Some old dynasties began to wane as wealth became less tied to inherited land and more to the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Peasants, by contrast, experienced unprecedented opportunities. Labor shortages meant that skilled and unskilled workers could demand higher wages, shorter working hours, or greater freedoms from feudal obligations. Many moved from village to village or from the countryside to towns, seeking better opportunities. This newfound mobility allowed them to escape the rigid hierarchies of the past, and to negotiate for living conditions that had previously been unimaginable. The simple act of survival became a form of economic leverage, and those who had endured the plague often found themselves more secure than before. The flow of wealth and trade also shifted. Markets, once tightly controlled by guilds and local authorities, became more responsive to supply and demand. Craftsmen, artisans, and merchants could command higher prices for their goods, and towns that had been nearly depopulated began to recover with more fluid social and economic structures. In rural areas, abandoned land was often consolidated or repurposed, sometimes by wealthier tenants or enterprising laborers, leading to new patterns of ownership and production. Inflation and scarcity reshaped daily life as well. Food and essential goods became more expensive, but those who could work found themselves in a stronger position to purchase necessities. Families that had survived the plague carefully managed resources, learned new trades, or shifted to different forms of labor to maintain stability. The economy, though still fragile, adapted to the new realities of a smaller, more mobile population. Over time, these changes eroded the strict feudal order that had governed medieval England for centuries. Nobles retained wealth and status, but their ability to command labor unconditionally weakened. Peasants gained unprecedented autonomy and leverage, and towns became centers of dynamic economic activity. The Black Death, while catastrophic in its immediate impact, catalyzed a slow but profound transformation, a society in which survival, skill, and adaptability mattered more than inherited position alone. In this way, England emerged from the plague not only scarred by loss, but also subtly reshaped. Economic power shifted, social mobility increased, and the balance between lords and laborers began to tilt, setting the stage for centuries of change. The long-term consequences of the Black Death, though invisible at first, would echo through the markets, fields, and streets of England for generations, altering the very foundation of life in a post-plague world. The Black Death did more than reduce the population of England. It fundamentally altered the social and economic structures that had defined medieval life for centuries. The feudal system, which had bound peasants to the land and secured the wealth of the nobility, began to fracture under the weight of mortality, scarcity, and shifting power dynamics. The old order, once seemingly unshakable, started to crumble, giving way to new systems that would shape England for generations to come. Before the plague, serfdom had been a rigid hierarchy. Peasants were tied to the land, obliged to provide labor, rent, and services to their lords. Lords, in turn, exercised authority over their estates with near absolute control, maintaining courts, collecting dues, and enforcing customs. The Black Death disrupted this equilibrium in ways no law, tradition, or army could contain. With so many laborers dead, the remaining peasants found themselves in a position of unprecedented leverage. Fields could not be tended, livestock could not be managed, and the wealth of a manor depended entirely on the willingness of surviving workers to cooperate. In response, lords were forced to make concessions, wages rose, contracts were renegotiated, and some serfs gained freedoms that had been unimaginable before the plague. Families moved from one estate to another in search of better opportunities, undermining the stability of manorial control. Legal attempts to freeze wages or restrict movement, such as the Statute of Laborers, were often ignored, revealing the limits of authority in a post-plague world. The very concept of hereditary obligation, so central to feudalism, was weakened, and a society once bound by rigid hierarchy began to show cracks that could not be easily repaired. The decline of serfdom had far-reaching consequences. With laborers able to negotiate terms and seek freedom, new economic models emerged. Towns grew in importance as centers of trade, crafts, and commerce, offering alternatives to the rural manorial system. Skilled workers and artisans gained autonomy, and wealth became increasingly tied to mobility, skill, and negotiation, rather than solely to inherited land. This shift allowed for greater social flexibility, as common people could carve out livelihoods and influence that had previously been denied. Moreover, the psychological impact of the plague contributed to the weakening of traditional authority. Survivors, having witnessed the indiscriminate power of disease, were less willing to accept unquestioned control from lords or the church. Communities began to experiment with self-reliance, collective decision-making, and local governance, creating subtle but important changes in social dynamics. The old deference to hierarchy was tempered by experience, and the seeds of a more fluid, resilient society were sown. By the end of the 14th century, England had begun to emerge from the immediate devastation of the plague, yet the world that survivors returned to was not the same as the one that had existed before 1348. The old medieval order anchored in serfdom, strict hierarchy, and predictable labor obligations was giving way to a society in which survival, skill, and negotiation shaped daily life. Lords still held titles and land, but their power was diminished, while peasants and laborers enjoyed freedoms that had once been impossible. In this way, the Black Death was both an end and a beginning. It ended the certainty and rigidity of medieval England's old order and opened the door to new social, economic, and cultural systems. Life, once dictated by hereditary status and obligation, now allowed room for change, mobility, and agency. The plague, in its devastation, became a catalyst for transformation, leaving England irrevocably altered and preparing the stage for the gradual decline of feudalism and the rise of a more dynamic, flexible society. As the shadows of the Black Death receded, England emerged from the catastrophe not as the land it had once been, but as a society profoundly altered by loss, fear, and resilience. Villages that had been emptied slowly filled again, markets reopened, and churches once deserted resonated with prayer and song. Yet beneath the surface of recovery lay the scars of devastation, a subtle and enduring reminder of the fragility of life. The plague had broken medieval England, exposing the limits of authority, the vulnerability of communities, and the unpredictability of existence in a world governed by disease and circumstance. Fields that had once been orderly and productive lay fallow, then slowly returned to labor under the hands of surviving peasants who now understood the value of their work in ways previous generations could not have imagined. The manorial system, which had tied laborers to land and lords to rigid hierarchies, weakened irreversibly. Serfs gained bargaining power. Artisans and craftsmen negotiated wages and contracts. Families moved to towns, seeking opportunities beyond the constraints of feudal obligations. The balance of power shifted quietly, imperceptibly at first, but with a force that would shape the centuries to follow. London and other urban centers, though scarred by mass graves and the memory of death, became places of adaptation and resilience. Surviving families rebuilt homes, reopened shops, and resumed trade, their lives forever shaped by the knowledge of mortality. Art, literature, and religious expression reflected this changed reality, turning toward themes of death, judgment, and the fleeting nature of human existence. Children who had witnessed loss grew up faster, laborers and peasants learned new forms of agency, and communities redefined their sense of cohesion in a world where survival depended on flexibility, courage, and cooperation. Yet, amid the grief and disruption, there was a quiet, almost imperceptible beauty in this transformation. Life, once tightly bound by rigid structures, became dynamic. The dead had left behind not only emptiness, but also opportunity, forcing the living to adapt, innovate, and assert their presence in a way that had never been possible before. England, though diminished in population, gained a new social vitality. Laborers could negotiate, families could move, towns could thrive, and a subtle sense of empowerment began to emerge from the ruins of loss. As we reflect on this, it becomes clear that the Black Death was not only an ending but also a beginning. It ended old certainties, tested faith, shattered customs, and forced adaptation under the harshest conditions imaginable. And yet, from that suffering, a changed England arose, one that was slower, quieter, and still haunted by memory, but also more resilient, more flexible, and subtly prepared for a future shaped by the lessons of survival. So as you listen and drift into sleep, imagine the empty streets slowly filling with life again, the quiet fields once abandoned returning to labor, and the people who survived learning to navigate a world forever altered. The Black Death broke medieval England, yes, but it also transformed it, leaving behind a legacy of resilience, adaptation, and human endurance that quietly shaped the centuries to come. Let the memory of that slow, measured recovery wash over you as the night deepens, and rest gently, knowing that even in the darkest times, life finds a way to continue.